welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation not just how the anti-abortion movement over the past few decades overtook the Republican Party, but how it turned the party into a more extreme one, including on issues even outside of abortion. My guest for this is Mary Ziegler. Mary Ziegler has written a book on this very issue. It's called Dollars for Life: The Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment. Mary Ziegler is a professor of law at UC Davis School of Law, and she is also the author of a previous book called After Roe, The Lost History of the Abortion Debate. Mary Ziegler, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Right at the beginning of your book, Dollars for Life, you make this interesting connection to what happened on January 6th, 2020, and the disruption of really trying to overturn the presidential election result to the anti-abortion movement. Talk to me about that.
Well, the book really focuses on how the anti-abortion movement, the role of the anti-abortion movement in the Republican Party has been, I think, underestimated, right? So if you listen to conventional historical narratives, you hear essentially that the Republican Party kind of used anti-abortion voters to get into office, but ultimately didn't do anything for them. And I think for many of us who've lived through the political years after 2016 and seen, many of the January 6th insurrection, carrying crosses and praying or even talking about abortion, that narrative didn't really sound right anymore. So as someone who'd studied the abortion struggle really for most of my career, I was interested in exactly, where the narrative of the anti-abortion movement not mattering went wrong. And I found that the influence of the anti-abortion movement was significant, obviously, on the way the Republican Party approaches abortion, but not just on that. Also, when it comes to how money and politics operate in this country, to how the kind of traditional authority figures in the Republican Party think sort of the people who are committeemen, people who are delegates every year at the Republican National Convention, donors who've been around for a really long time, party figureheads who've been around for a really long time, how those people have gradually lost power, right? And we see increasingly extreme forces exercising influence in their stead. So I was surprised to see the extent to which the anti-abortion movement contributed to all of those things. And I think it's a particularly timely story because people are asking a lot now that the Supreme Court has overruled Roe, how all of this happened. And their focus, I think, has tended to be on, within the abortion world, if you will, like what arguments won out, et cetera. But this is, I think, that story, and the story in Dollars for Life is really a story more about institutions and how democracy erodes more than it is a story about how, particular arguments about abortion carried the day.
Did some of the people who are prominent in the anti-abortion movement file lawsuits to challenging state elections in certain places around the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jim Bopp, who's the sort of central figure in Dollars for Life, he's obviously not the only person who was involved in a lot of the story, but he's probably the character you follow the most. He was the general counsel of the National Right to Life Committee, the person who was mainly behind the litigation of the Citizens United case, and a major figure in where we are now in campaign spending and abortion. He also represented an organization some may be familiar with called True the Vote in early efforts to overturn the 2020 election, although he then withdrew many of those lawsuits. I think, and if you asked him to this day, he would say that he did not do that because he thought it was wrong to try to overturn the 2020 election. He will do that. He will say essentially that there wasn't the strategy and tactics used by the Trump administration were doomed to fail, not because the election was legitimate, but because the planning hadn't been very well executed, and he didn't want his name on what he believed would have been a failed strategy.
James Bopp Jr. is an important figure in the story that you tell, and even as you mentioned him, you mentioned his connection to overturning campaign finance laws. How is money and politics connected to all of this?
So interestingly, you wouldn't intuitively think that the anti-abortion movement would be invested in money and politics, because if we think about the figures we associate with that fight, we think of people like the Koch brothers, right? People with a lot of money. And while I don't want to underestimate how many resources the anti-abortion movement has, anti-abortion PACs are not the wealthiest PACs in American politics. Many rank and file anti-abortion voters are not wealthy at all, right? So it's not evident that more money in politics would naturally help the anti-abortion movement at all, much less help the anti-abortion movement gain influence in a GOP that has plenty of money flowing into it from other quarters, right? How this happened was that in the 90s, the anti-abortion movement had to shift focus from a nationwide ban through a constitutional amendment to controlling the Supreme Court. And their strategy had been get Republicans elected president and get Republicans elected to the Senate. That they thought would mean a Supreme Court that would overrule Roe. But in 1992, that didn't work. You had a 6-justice conservative supermajority that still didn't overturn Roe. So the lesson the anti-abortion movement learned from that essentially was that they didn't have enough influence in the GOP. Even when the GOP won, even when the GOP put people on the court, the anti-abortion movement wasn't calling the shots. So in looking for new ways to get more influence, one answer that many came to, including bopp, was money, right? That money would help get more Republicans elected. It would help the right kind of Republicans, so to speak. So Republicans who are more ideologically invested in the abortion issue get elected. It would prove the worth of the anti-abortion movement to the GOP, right? The GOP had long wondered if it was helpful from a standpoint of elections to be opposed to abortion when most Americans were not. If the anti-abortion movement was sort of a central part of the fight to deregulate campaign spending or even to find workarounds to existing limits, that would be another value that the anti-abortion movement could add. And ultimately, I think the anti-abortion movement thought that money in politics could be a way to erode the power of the establishment in the GOP and to replace it with conservative movements, whether that was the gun rights movement, anti-LGBTIQ movements, the anti-abortion movement itself, and that could, of course, make the country very different in ways the anti-abortion movement wanted to see.
That's very interesting because I think, and you alluded to this, when we do think about these overturning campaign finance laws, we think about the power of big money, of large corporations having outweighed influence in elections. And again, as you said, it's not that the anti-abortion movement doesn't have any money at all, but certainly they're not the Koch brothers, or they're not Citibank or Citigroup or any of these major spenders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the stories that emerges in Dollars for Life is that if you kind of are dividing the era of the sort of pre and post Citizens United, one change you see is that pre-Citizens United, there was still a lot of money flowing into politics. And pretty much every election we've had, presidential or congressional, for some time, there's been more spending. But I think before Citizens United, parties controlled a lot of that money. And there were exceptions, right? Barack Obama famously raised record-shattering amounts of money from small donors, but a lot of the time parties were kind of pulling the strings when it came to raising and spending a lot of money. By opening the door to unlimited independent expenditures from corporations, Citizens United unleashed this new era in what lawyers call outside spending, right? So think about super PACs, nonprofits that are kind of dark money groups. These are things we didn't really see before Citizens United. And that didn't mean necessarily that anti-abortion groups were themselves controlling this, but it meant that big donors who were interested in extreme causes, right, who did not necessarily want to disclose that, who didn't want their shareholders to know that, who didn't want their neighbors to know that, who didn't want their colleagues to know that, had all of these new outside spending vehicles into which to route their money, right? It's very hard to identify who's giving to nonprofits and super PACs. And it was also, I think, interestingly hard for some of the traditional forces in the GOP, which had been happy to kind of dog whistle to extremists, but also at the end of the day wanted electable candidates, right? They wanted people in power who would preserve their own interests. And that meant that if someone was too much of an extremist or a populist, those traditional bigwigs in the party ultimately didn't want them at the top of the ticket because it was just too risky. You could risk losing to a Democrat. Those people also lost a lot of influence because the money game was being played by everyone everywhere. When you had all these outside spending groups, you couldn't have the traditional powers that be in the Republican Party say, okay, well, this candidate, Marjorie Taylor Greene or somebody like that is toxic and we're going to get rid of her, or Donald Trump or whoever. That strategy on the money side didn't work anymore. And that, I think in some ways, that was what the anti-abortion movement had ultimately been hoping for. And
they knew this going into it. They were supporting, it was a Supreme Court decision. Well, obviously you could talk more about the Supreme Court, but it was a Supreme Court decision that the Citizens United case concerning campaign spending. But coming into all of this, the anti-abortion movement realized this, that if we could just circumvent the party leadership, then we can have more influence.
I mean, yes and no, right? So the story in Dollars for Life is really more about how effectively opportunistic the anti-abortion movement was. So there's a lot of moments when they have a strategy. So the strategy in Citizens United was actually a dark money strategy. That was what they wanted. They wanted the Supreme Court to go in and say, you know what, all these like very pathetically ineffective rules we have now on disclosure and disclaimers, by the way, those are unconstitutional too. So dark money can be even darker, right? That was what they were hoping for. And that didn't work. The Supreme Court upheld federal disclosure and disclaimer laws, and they focused instead on corporate independent expenditures. But as soon as that happened, I think the rationale behind the focus on dark money, which had been to kind of allow for more power for outside groups, more power for extreme donors, they saw a way to do that through what the Supreme Court had given them. So it's not so much a story, I think, about, people who had this amazing master plan that they executed to perfection. It's sort of more a story of this movement proceeding in fits and starts and seeing opportunities that other people missed and exploiting them in ways that changed our democracy.
And again, this is undercutting the Republican leadership, the Republican establishment. And I think if we can look in history, maybe even go back before the Roe v. Wade decision in the 1970s, there was a time where quite frequently it was Republicans who supported a woman's right to an abortion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that continued for a while, right? I think so within the GOP, you had, even as late as, the early 90s, you had, Lee Atwater, who was the famous sort of, hit person who put political hits out for George H.W. Bush, working behind the scenes to launch Republicans for Choice. You had, pro-choice Republicans in Congress for some time. And so the GOP, and I think even after that, there was a sense in which the GOP may not have been pro-choice exactly, obviously, but that there was a sense in which many in the party ultimately didn't want Roe to be overturned. They thought that was the dog catching the car. They certainly didn't want to ban abortion. So they wanted to do, just enough to keep anti-abortion voters with them, but not really actually do anything substantive to advance the anti-abortion agenda. And that, I think, wasn't lost on leaders of the anti-abortion movement, who were pretty savvy and wanted to change the political game in such a way that that was no longer an option for politicians.
Was there a time where you would equally find, or roughly equally speaking, anti-abortion lawmakers in both parties?
Oh, yeah, totally. So, I mean, until you get to the early 80s, party affiliation wasn't very predictive of somebody's view on abortion. So, the first times you see a young Joe Biden talking about abortion in Congress, it's to sort of support the Hyde Amendment or other measures like it, right? And say essentially taxpayers shouldn't be forced to act against their consciences and support what they see as killing. You see, Dick Gephardt, lots of, Dick Durbin early enough in his career. There are lots of people, when the 1972 presidential election, rolls around, that's McGovern versus Nixon. McGovern's running mate was Thomas Eagleton, who was one of the most pro-life members of Congress, a Democrat. So it was very common to see pro-life Democrats or anti-abortion Democrats throughout the 70s. It's really not until the early 80s that at the elite party level, you would automatically say, okay, if someone is in the National Republican Party, they're probably opposed to abortion. Someone's in the National Democratic Party, they're probably for abortion rights. And it took really until the 90s for voters to sort themselves out, right? I mean, you'd see lots of anti-abortion voters still choosing Democrats well into the 90s. And of course, even today, there are people who I think whose views on abortion don't really fit within either party, or it's still messy even now. But I think that even the kind of basic elite party alignment that's familiar to us took a while to take shape.
How do you see the origins of the anti-abortion movement? Because it is interesting. We do have states beginning to outlaw, and then almost all states outlaw abortion in the 1800s, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, which is interesting because up to that point, abortion was legal and a common practice here in the United States and really throughout the world, historically speaking. But then we get this movement to outlaw abortion in the 19th century. And now it sounds like we have another anti-abortion movement that sparks up, perhaps in response to Roe v. Wade. I'll let you clarify that. Do you see
Sure.
do you see them connected, or do you see these as two separate movements?
I mean, they're pretty separate. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a through line. So the 19th century movement is very much a doctor-led movement. The American Medical Association is at the center of it. The American Medical Association is, lobbying state legislatures. They're putting out talking points. They're convincing other doctors. And their reasoning is kind of complicated. Some of it was certainly that doctors thought that abortion involved, taking a fetal life. Some of it seems to have been about professional advancement because doctors in the AMA were competing with midwives and other alternative practitioners, and they were using their views on abortion essentially to say we're more civilized, we're more knowledgeable than these competitors. Some of it was nativism, right? Anti-immigrant sentiment, because there was a fear among some of these people in the American Medical Association that women they saw as non-white. So these were usually immigrants from places like Ireland, Germany, even China were having too many babies, and that women they would have seen as white. So people from, England and Germany, or England primarily, and were not having enough babies, right? And so banning abortion would mean better eugenic results. And there was plenty of just good old-fashioned misogyny too. They thought abortion was sort of middle class or educated women giving up their roles as mothers and wives to do other things with their lives. They didn't like that either. The second kind of, or I guess the more modern anti-abortion movement really got going in the 60s, not after Roe v. Wade. And it got going as soon as really states started considering laws, that would reform access to abortion. So the first big push in this direction came from this group called the American Law Institute that proposed a model law that would allow abortion in cases of like rape, incest, certain health threats, certain fetal conditions. And almost immediately in lots of states, anti-abortion groups formed to fight this. They were not centered in the medical profession. They were often originally centered in the Catholic Church. The early anti-abortion groups, they eventually grew to include other religions, but they were, I think, originally more focused on law than the early anti-abortion movement had been. The idea that there's a constitutional right to life or that a fetus is a rights-holding person, like none of these constitutional arguments existed in the 19th century. And then the modern anti-abortion movement that you're probably thinking of is sort of what happens when the pre-Roe anti-abortion movement, which continues to exist, is joined by an influx of white evangelical Protestants who had not been interested in the anti-abortion movement at all in the 60s and 70s, and then overcome some anti-Catholicism and some doctrinal teachings in their churches that change, and join and transform the anti-abortion movement in the 80s and beyond. So now we have a kind of anti-abortion movement that has as its origins, the 60s era predominantly Catholic movement and the ways that it was transformed by, primarily Southern, primarily evangelical movement in the 80s and after.
It is interesting to learn that in the 19th century, an argument was not that a fetus would have a constitutional right.
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, that was, that's obviously consequential now because there are folks who are saying that the framers of the 14th Amendment thought that a fetus was a rights-holding person. And obviously, whenever you're talking about when people were thinking, like, who knows, maybe they thought that. But when states were passing laws criminalizing abortion in the 19th century, they were almost, like, to my knowledge, they never said that they were doing that because they had to constitutionally or because fetuses had rights. They never said that. They just were essentially saying abortion is a crime, in the same way that, you states say anything else is a crime, right? They're not saying they're obligated to say it's a crime. They're just saying as a matter of state policy, they've chosen to say that it's a crime.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Mary Ziegler. Mary Ziegler is a professor of law at UC Davis School of Law, and we are in conversation about her book called Dollars for Life, the Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment. So after the decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973, the tactics of the anti-abortion movement are interesting. In the early years after this landmark decision, the goal was to get Congress to pass a constitutional amendment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's very clear that emerges from the history is that people who expect the anti-abortion movement to be content now that Roe is gone have completely missed the narrative, because the anti-abortion movement beginning in the 60s, carrying on through the 70s, and definitely after Roe as well, the goal has always been personhood, meaning recognition of the idea that a fetus is a rights holding person that gets due process and equal protection under the law. And so when Roe came down, the objection wasn't that Roe recognized rights for women and pregnant people. The objection was that Roe didn't make abortion unconstitutional everywhere, right? So the initial push was for a constitutional amendment that would do just that, right? That would define personhood to include a fetus and have the effect of basically making abortion unconstitutional, in places like California as much as in places like, Alabama. So that had been the movement's goal really for more than a decade, or at least a decade after.
So they weren't trying to have an amendment that would ensure that states had the right to determine what to do about abortion. That amendment was about outlawing abortion.
Right. And interestingly, there were actually several attempts in Congress to pass an amendment allowing the states to decide. And the first time that happened, the anti-abortion movement was universally opposed to it. You would see anti-abortion groups saying, letting states decide is just as bad as Roe v. Wade, right? And then a later iteration in the 80s got a little further, but again, it had too much anti-abortion opposition to pass. So this has never been about states' rights. And I think obviously anyone paying attention now gets the strong impression that it's still not about states' rights, but that's not surprising if you know the history, because that wasn't really the focal point.
Is this a bipartisan effort at the beginning, or when do we start to see? And you mentioned even up through the 80s and beyond, we still have pro-life Democrats, probably still do. But when do we see? How do we see the anti-abortion movement start to connect itself more firmly with the Republican Party?
So primarily in the 1980s, you see. I think there are two things that happen at that point that make that appealing. One is that Ronald Reagan strongly identified as a pro-life Republican in a way that others hadn't. So instead of just sort of like Gerald Ford and other Republicans had sort of very reluctantly not opposed what anti-abortion groups were doing, Ronald Reagan really embraced the anti-abortion movement and promised to do everything the anti-abortion movement wanted because he thought it was advantageous.
He supported a constitutional amendment?
He did, and he supported a full ban, and he promised to put judges on the Supreme Court who would overrule Roe. And so it seemed kind of almost politically necessary to be Republican to people in the anti-abortion movement at the time. The other thing that changed was the rise of the religious right. So you had, for the first time, large, very wealthy white evangelical organizations, megachurches that were opposed to abortion. And it's worth emphasizing that the anti-abortion movement that was greeting these phenomena was largely poor and isolated politically, right? Many of the biggest, richest anti-abortion groups were in debt. They didn't have politicians supporting them. When you had, pretty conservative far-right politicians or groups offering support, it was irresistible, right, to a movement that had been more politically diverse because there wasn't really a meaningful alternative.
And then they're disappointed, however, actually, let me go back to Reagan. Because you said the common story here is the Republican Party co-opted the religious right. And oftentimes, even beyond the Republican Party, is Ronald Reagan himself. Do you think that story is wrong about Ronald Reagan masterfully coming in and co-opting the religious right?
I mean, it's not entirely wrong. It's more just that, the story doesn't end with Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, I think if you study, the path that takes us to the reversal of Roe, there are obviously lots of reversals of fortune for religious conservatives, but Reagan wasn't, history didn't stop with Reagan, as much as it sometimes sounds like that when you listen to some politicians. It continued, right? And so I think Reagan certainly didn't do a lot of what anti-abortion groups wanted. He picked people for the Supreme Court they were not happy with, who ultimately did things that were devastating to their movement. He didn't use much political capital to advance their agenda. He didn't really fight for the kind of constitutional amendment they wanted. And yet they continued to vote for him in 1984 and to continue to vote for his candidates thereafter. So if you were just looking at this from the vantage point of 1982 or 1984, that story of religious conservatives being used by the GOP would have rung true. Of course, people in the anti-abortion movement realized this to some extent, right? So there was a constant kind of adjustment and strategizing of how to avoid this fate going forward, especially after Reagan, who was at the time a kind of uniquely popular figure, was no longer in office.
What is this push on the Republican Party doing to the Democratic Party?
Well, in the Democratic Party at the same time, women and people of color are gaining influential positions in the DNC for the first time. And so there's more of a push on the Democratic side to stop running away from abortion rights in the way that the party once had, when it was, I think, more dominated by, kind of conventionally male white union leaders. So that was happening independently of what Reagan was doing. But I think Reagan embracing the anti-abortion movement also, I think, pushed Democrats who were not feminists or who were not as in tune with the kind of emerging equality agenda to get on board.
Do you find similar dynamic with the pro-choice movement and their influence on the Democratic Party as you do with the anti-abortion movement on the Republican Party?
Not really, no. So it's a very different dynamic, right? Because within the Democratic Party, there's long a sense that most Americans are pro-choice, right? So Democrats don't have the same anxiety usually about doing things that are unpopular when they talk about abortion rights. But they also often, if you're looking at presidential papers, don't seem to have the sense that pro-choice Americans care that much, right? There's not a sense that the majority of pro-choice voters are as motivated as the minority of pro-life voters are, or anti-abortion voters are for the Republicans. So the dynamics are very different in both of those ways. And there also isn't the same anxiety usually within the pro-choice movement about Democrats abandoning them or becoming an anti-abortion party. Like there's very little worry about that. There's some worry about Democrats not prioritizing their issues. Usually the historic response of some of the wealthier kind of organizations like Planned Parenthood is to sort of meet Democratic politicians where they are, prioritize what the politicians want them to prioritize. And that has its own pathology because that often means de-emphasizing the needs, for example, of people of color, low-income people, because donors aren't excited about that, or party leaders aren't motivated by that, or they're compromising on the Hyde Amendment, which is a ban on Medicaid funding for abortion. But it's a very different dynamic, I think, that you see with Democrats and with Republicans.
Anti-abortion activists get frustrated when Republicans fail to get a constitutional ban on abortion through Congress. Were they close to getting that through?
Not really. I mean, the closest there were some close votes. There was never really a sense that this was going to happen. And the reason for that, I think, was one, they were never close to getting the votes for what the anti-abortion movement actually wanted, right? Like an actual personhood amendment. And then there were some closer calls with basically amendments like the one, or like the language of Dobbs, right? Sort of states' rights amendments, but even those fell short, in part because Democrats were universally opposed to them, but Republicans weren't universally supportive of them because for some Republicans, that didn't go far enough, right? So there wasn't really ever a sense, like if you go back to the time, there was never a sense that politicians or people in either movement really thought this would happen at all. I mean, I don't think.
It really reminds me when I was a Capitol Hill reporter back in 2005 and Republicans were pushing a constitutional amendment to ensure that marriage was only between a man and a woman. And now and that didn't make it through, even though it wasn't clear at the time, but that didn't make it through. And so I just sort of assumed that that whole issue is dead now, but here we are.
Nope. I don't know.
Yeah. So it's after, and with this frustration in which the anti-abortion movement is unable to get this constitutional amendment through Congress, they gave up on that. And that's when they really put their attention towards the courts.
Right. So I think at that point, what happens at around the time the last constitutional amendment campaign fails, the Supreme Court upholds or strikes down this abortion ordinance from Akron, Ohio, which sounds pretty random, but this had been a kind of model for the rest of the country. But Sandra Day O'Connor, whom Ronald Reagan nominated to the court, writes a dissent essentially saying that Roe v. Wade is unworkable. And anti-abortion groups had really hated Sandra Day O'Connor. They thought she was this stealth pro-choice judge. But they look at this dissent and said, well, wow, maybe we can work with this, because if Ronald Reagan appointed, 5 Sandra Day O'Connors or 6 Sandra Day O'Connors, at least we could get Roe overturned. And maybe we could even do better than that. Maybe with a conservative enough Supreme Court, they would recognize personhood, right? If we can't get it through the democratic process. So this also, I think, becomes a way of kind of post hoc justifying this alliance with the GOP, which had been really predicated on the idea of getting a constitutional amendment done. That had been the appeal of Ronald Reagan. So if the constitutional amendment's off the table, then the question is like, well, what are you doing giving all this money to Republicans and aligning with Republicans? And the answer became, you're getting, the Supreme Court you want, right? In the Supreme Court you want will at a minimum overturn Roe v. Wade.
Where's this money coming from?
Well, I mean, in the beginning, like I mentioned, there's not much of it. I mean, the 1970s anti-abortion movement, the money is coming from nowhere because there is no money. Over time, anti-abortion groups are pretty good at the PAC model, right, of getting motivated, angry, conservative, small dollar donors. That's not initially for them a very sustainable model, because when those donors are not as motivated, which is usually when conservatives are already in office, they stop donating. Over time, anti-abortion groups begin to tap kind of bigger dollar donors like Tom Monahan, who's the founder of Domino's Pizza. There are other kind of mega donors who on the right who are socially conservative. But some of it, I think, as well, is anti-abortion groups aligning with other movement conservative PACs on issues like guns or Tea Partiers, and exercising power that way, essentially saying, that the more the establishment is weakened and the more chaos there is, the more room for the anti-abortion movement to exercise influence in the GOP.
When do you start to see the Republican establishment starting to get chipped away at?
It's very gradual, right? So it's not just about money. Part of it, I think the most difficult piece of it is just that the electorate polarizes, right? So if you look at how different Republican and Democratic voters are across a range of issues, today in 2022, and compare that to the 90s, the differences are really stark. That's happening at the same time that there's a big escalation in what scholars call negative and effective partisanship. So the basic idea that you really don't like people in the other party. It may not be that you're voting for somebody because you like them or you think they're going to do anything, but you really hate people in the other party. And negative and effective partisanship grows exponentially in the United States since the 1980s. And that, of course, fuels populism and extremism in the GOP, because then even when there are candidates like Donald Trump, whom Republican voters really don't like, there's no way they're going to vote for a Democrat anyway, which means that there's not as much to stop those candidates from emerging. People won't cross party lines to stop them. And then I think when you see it the most obviously, because those trends are much kind of more gradual, is when you see, in particular, the rise of the conservative media. So conservative talk radio is big in the 90s. Expands to include Fox News Channel, which was founded in 1996 and quickly becomes one of the leading news broadcasts, and ultimately the leading news broadcast in the United States. Is joined by groups like OAN, Newsmax, conservative social media. And so I think all of that changes the dynamic too, in the sense that conservative media both amplifies the voices of more extreme forces in the party and rewards them, right? I mean, people who are compromisers or willing to seek consensus are kind of demonized in conservative media. So I think when people in America wake up to the idea that the party establishment is losing power is in the 90s and 2000s with the rise of conservative media, even though some of the trends are going on behind the scenes for even longer.
Rush Limbaugh, I suspect, is a key figure in this.
Yeah, I mean, Rush Limbaugh was kind of the avatar of the conservative media who made a big difference to this, in part because, I mean, for many years until really the mid to late 1990s, Rush Limbaugh was conservative media, right? But he was massively successful. So when I say Rush Limbaugh was conservative media, I mean that both in the sense that conservative media was underdeveloped, but also in the sense that Rush Limbaugh had just that much cultural influence.
Again, you are listening to Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Mary Ziegler. Mary Ziegler is the author of the book, Dollars for Life, the Anti-Abortion Movement, and the Fall of the Republican Establishment. And so for you, the 2010 Citizen United decision was just sort of the breaking of the dam. This pressure was building upon it. But then once we overturned some of the campaign finance laws, allowed for dark spending, then did that just accelerate what we were seeing up to that point?
Yeah, so I mean, any historian is always going to say, I mean, the joke, if you talk to historians and you ask them a question, they'll always lead with, it's complicated, right? So it wasn't just about Citizens United or money, but that made a big difference too. So the most striking, I think, contrast you can draw is between Donald Trump and Pat Buchanan. So many people think of Pat Buchanan as this kind of like a joke, right? And a kind of has-been also ran who was never a serious candidate. But if you go back to 1992 and 1996, Buchanan was a serious threat for the GOP nomination. In 96, he had a tremendous following, just like Donald Trump. He was good TV. He was funny. He made fun of his opponents. He won several of the big first primaries. And then essentially the GOP establishment said he's unelectable. And Bob Dole, who was running against him, outspent him by, I don't remember the margin, but it was insanely large margin. Dole had one of the Koch brothers as the vice chairman of his campaign. Almost any major right-leaning corporation you can think of, from Gallo Wines to Nabisco Cookies to Philip Morris, shipped in massive amounts of money to Dole. When Donald Trump came around in 2016, because outside spending had surged in the aftermath of Citizens United, there was no way for the GOP to shut off sources of potential financial salvation to Donald Trump. Of course, Donald Trump had the money to self-fund his campaign, but he also had outside spending that he could tap as well. That doesn't mean that Donald Trump, got the most outside money. It doesn't mean that Donald Trump outraised his primary opponents at all. It just meant that there was enough kind of financial safety nets in a post-Citizens United world for Trump to survive in a way that hadn't been true for Buchanan, even though Buchanan, I think, like Trump, scratched a particular itch for a lot of GOP primary voters and was much better liked and loved by many GOP primary voters than the kind of, establishment alternative, which would have been something like Jeb Bush in 2016 or Bob Dole in 96.
Does this correspond with the rise of the Tea Party? Is also sort of around that period of time.
Absolutely. I mean, the Tea Party, I think, was really influential in the sense that the Tea Party was sort of the first trial run of some of the things you would see Trump doing. Tea Partiers were very good at the outside money game. They made the idea of the establishment a dirty word. They made it such that all Republicans had to portray themselves as populists or insurgents to have any kind of success. And they convinced forces within the anti-abortion movement, as well as other conservative movements like the gun rights movement, that there was a path to success that involved the destruction of the traditional party leadership, right? That this was possible. So the Tea Party was sort of also a business model that lots of other conservative movements tried to build upon.
Why this connection, though, from the anti-abortion sentiments and politics to other extreme politics?
Well, I think at times these were alliances of convenience. So there's lots of overlapping membership, right? There are people who are in the anti-abortion movement who are also Christian nationalists. There are people, bopp, for example, is very heavily involved in anti-LGBTIQ activism, right? There are people who are heavily involved in the gun rights movement too. So some of it is just people moving between movements, but some of it was just strategic priorities aligning, right? So you see, for example, in 2016, bopp and some anti-abortion groups reaching out to, gun rights groups like the NRA and saying essentially, none of us like, the enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? None of us like what Mitt Romney did in 2012. None of us like that the GOP establishment isn't extreme enough on our issues. And so let's all get together and try to change this. Not necessarily because I think they're all ideologically aligned on one another's issues too, but ultimately it's that they want a different kind of Republican Party. That's the priority.
Bopp is a name that keeps coming up. James Bopp Jr. This is somebody that you find from the beginning of the story that you tell of the 1970s all the way up to the present moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Just last week, actually, we saw a story of a 10-year-old girl who was raped and got pregnant and had to travel to Indiana for abortion. Who was at the center of that story? Of course, it was James Bopp, who's in Indiana, who said that he thought the law in Indiana should be changed so that that child would have to carry that pregnancy to term. We've seen Bopp's name in the news. He's been defending Madison Cawthorn and Marjorie Taylor Greene and others accused of insurrection. We saw Bopp in the news in earlier phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, fighting vaccine requirements. So he continues to be this kind of central figure in the American right, and also someone I think who's a kind of bridge figure for different moving pieces on the American right.
Have you ever interviewed James Bopp Jr.?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, how the story in part of how this book got going was interesting because I'd interviewed him for other books. And I had access to his papers for this book, with obviously lots of limitations governed by attorney-client privilege. But he actually, in his archive, which I've had access to, he has a folder on me because he knows a lot about. So he's watching. He may listen to this broadcast. Who knows? But I've interviewed him more than once. The things I told you about his views on overturning the 2020 election were from interviews in the past year or so.
Did you get to see the file he has on you?
I didn't ask for it. I was too. I thought it. I don't know. It just rooted me out too much.
It would be weird.
I mean, I imagine. I mean, I have an idea of what could be in it from files he has on other people. So it's probably just my published writings and stuff like that.
What's next for people like James Bopp?
Well, obviously, Bopp in particular. I mean, it's everything, right? I mean, so he's working on voting stuff, right? So he's already, I think, involved in limiting access to mail-in voting and that sort of thing for 2024. Poll watchers, he still works very closely with True the Vote. And there's obviously a lot on the abortion side. Bopp has a model law he wants states to adopt that defines aiding and abetting very broadly to include a lot of what most people would think of as protected speech. Ultimately, on the abortion side, there's personhood, right? I mean, back to the constitutional amendment we talked about, that's some version of that, whether it's accomplished through a national statute or the Supreme Court, has always remained the movement's agenda. But Bopp, of course, also wants a different kind of GOP still, right? I mean, I think that's still on the agenda. So the transformation of the GOP we've seen so far, I think in his view would be incomplete. So I think you'd expect to see even more changes, like an even more right-facing GOP than the one we already know.
What do you think are the prospects if Republicans were? Well, they probably couldn't do it. They couldn't do it really with a Democratic president. But what is the prospect, do you think, of the future of a law coming out of Congress to ban abortion? That has been talked a little bit about. That Mitch McConnell said that they would at least talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just depends on if they're willing to get rid of the filibuster. And if they do get rid of the filibuster, I think there would 100% be a law banning abortion. Then, of course, if they lose control of Congress, which they almost certainly would at some point, then you'd have things swing all the way back to probably some protection for abortion rights, right? So I think that's going to be the dilemma for congressional Republicans. And also, I think for senators in particular, there may be senators who are from places, Republicans from places like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin who are, opposed to abortion, but would worry about a federal ban. So I'm not sure. I think it depends on how willing Republicans are to get rid of the filibuster.
Does the anti-abortion movement have a position on the filibuster?
I mean, now I think they're opposed to getting rid of the filibuster because it would mean passage of the Women's Health Protection Act. And if Republicans control Congress and the White House, I'm sure they'll be very much in favor of getting rid of the filibuster.
Is it something they talk about, the filibuster?
Well, they've talked about the filibuster to say that it shouldn't be eliminated because of the Women's Health Protection Act. But I mean, I don't imagine there's going to be a lot of consistency on that.
Yeah, hardly the stability that Samuel Alito wrote about in this decision.
No, I mean, oh my God. I mean, anyone who studies the history, that was just, I mean, I don't know if that was intended to be trolling, but that is trolling. I mean, there are many things you could say would happen. And I mean, even people who are opposed to abortion would, I don't think, seriously have expected stability and tranquility after Roe was overturned. And if anything, it's been, I mean, there are fights between states on the travel fights between the states and federal government on emergency medical treatment, on abortion medication. And I think that we're just beginning to see how ugly it's going to get because states have just begun to unveil their plans for a post-Roe America, right? I don't even think we know what that's going to look like fully.
It is very interesting to think about the role in American life now that the Supreme Court plays. I think for, a good portion of the 20th century, at least the middle of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, you could make an argument that the Supreme Court was ahead of other governmental institutions when it comes to advancing rights. now it feels like we have a Supreme Court that's quite behind the rest of the country.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing, of course, that meant if you looked at the dynamic, if you'd asked sort of what the standard default assumption was about the Supreme Court, it would be that the Supreme Court doesn't ever want to get too far ahead of popular opinion, right? So that it would be in the vanguard on some civil rights issues, but not very much in the vanguard, right? That the court was a kind of small c conservative, anxious about backlash kind of institution. And even when the court became conservative, there was still a sense that that dynamic prevailed, that the court wouldn't want to get too far behind popular opinion because the court would people would ignore the court, people would strip the court of jurisdiction, people would impose term limits, like whatever bad things from the standpoint of the court's power would happen. And clearly the justices on the court now are not worried about any of that, right? And so I think the interesting question going forward for all of us is if anyone calls the court's bluff, right? If the Biden administration does, but I think primarily if voters do, right? If people care enough about the things the court is doing to make those issues enough of a political priority for the people in power. And I think that remains to be seen.
Is overturning Roe v. Wade going to change the pro-choice movement? And is there anything that the pro-choice movement can learn from the anti-abortion movement and what it has achieved with this overturning of Roe v. Wade?
I don't know. Obviously, if the pro-choice movement is going to change, there are some signs that it will. There absolutely are lessons. I mean, I think one lesson is that institutions matter, right? So that the pro-choice movement has to think not just in terms of how people view reproductive rights and justice, but also how people vote, whether people have access to the vote, what the composition of the court looks like, how money in politics works. You know, that this is really about playing the game at all levels, not just focusing on your issue. And that's something that I don't think abortion rights groups did particularly well. Like there were moments, for example, when Planned Parenthood was not campaigning with other groups on voting rights because it was essentially saying, well, voting's not our thing, right? That's not what we're here for. Whereas you had anti-abortion groups saying, that's what we're here for. We're going to work with True the Vote and we're going to work with Citizens United because they understood that all these things come together. The other lesson, I think, is a lesson about the extent to which intensity matters. It's not the case that there's ever been more than maybe 20% of Americans who want abortion to be illegal under all circumstances. And yet those people have had such a huge influence on the GOP and such a huge influence on our politics. And so if someone is supportive of reproductive rights and justice, the question for them is how to match that level of intensity and commitment, right? Because then it's not a question of numbers. Those have never been a problem. It's a question of intensity, right? And making that intensity into something that a party can't ignore. I don't think that's something that pro-choice groups have learned yet, but I think the history could be helpful as a guide there.
Going back to congressional efforts to deal with abortion, if Democrats were to codify the right to an abortion in law, could the Supreme Court just strike that down too? And do you think it would?
Yeah, totally. And I think they would. I think if we're being honest, because the two bases that the Supreme Court would probably look at would be either the 14th Amendment, right? So the idea that there is, there's a civil right that would apply to abortion. That's not going to work because the Supreme Court has said Congress can't define new rights. They can only enforce rights the Supreme Court has announced. If the Supreme Court has just finished saying there is no right to abortion, Congress can't say that by invoking the 14th Amendment. Congress could also look to the Interstate Commerce Clause, but the conservatives on the court are cynical about broad interpretations of Congress's commerce power. So it's quite likely they would not be into that argument either. So, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why conversations on the left are probably going to return to some idea of court reform, because I think many of the other things you see advocates pushing for, like federal legislation, might run into the buzzsaw that is the Supreme Court otherwise.
So interesting to hear about the 14th Amendment. This is a Civil War amendment, such an important amendment where so many people's rights stem from ever since, beginning with formerly enslaved people to women and immigrants and people with disabilities and gays and lesbians. And and now it's being used by the anti-abortion movement.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the 14th Amendment, interestingly, is the one invoked by anti abortion forces, too. This is where they locate personhood. And
Yes.
so, another way of understanding the stakes of what this struggle is about is it's really also a struggle about what we mean by equality and where equality comes from. Because, of course, the fight for personhood is one that says equality is about biology, right? It's about the fact that fetuses are not outside of bodies, they're inside of bodies, and they're dependent on other people to survive. And to the extent anti abortion groups expand beyond fetuses, they talk about elderly people or people with disabilities, people with other kind of biological handicaps. They don't talk about, histories of subordination, right? Which is why there's some, I think, lineup between people who are opposed to abortion and people who are not supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement or, the LGBTIQ movement, because histories of oppression aren't really what they're thinking about. They don't think that's where discrimination really hits home. They think it's about biology. So it's also kind of in some ways a fight about, what the 14th Amendment means, what its legacy means, and what equality broadly defined means.
Mary Ziegler has been our guest. Again, Mary Ziegler is a professor of law at UC Davis School of Law, and she has joined us to talk about her book, Dollars for Life, the Anti-Abortion Movement and the Fall of the Republican Establishment. Mary Ziegler, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thanks for having me.